that's a genius, is to be able to see the things, the ordinary, in totally different light. Now, when you do something like that and you produce something, there is a difference between like an engineering production and artistic production. And I'm not sure that you need to suffer to produce a cell phone. But, does artistic genius need a certain habitat or a certain environment to really be nurtured properly? And I'm throwing that question out.
Pam, as you're talking, I'm just wondering who decides all this? Is there a sense of the classics, like will it last a certain amount of time, or, if you're going to look at jobs, and I think that's a really interesting appraisal. We didn't have to wait too long for that one. So I don't know the answer. This is just something I'm curious about, whether, who does get to be the judge. I mean, we say genius a lot quickly anyway. So,
and sometimes it just means it's a very smart person. So is there a difference between a very smart person and a genius?
Or a clever person.
Or a clever person.
Or we can monetize from that person.
Right.
Somebody who's contributing to make our world better or worse.
I think it's a kind of a combination. I think there has to be some sort of innate ability or affinity. But then if it's not sort of practiced, then I've read Malcolm Gladwell's The Outliers.
Right.
And he talks about the need for 10,000 hours of practice. That the Beatles, when they were in Germany, they played music 8 hours a day, right? Like 3 years. Bill Gates had access to a computer at a very early age, and he was on that computer for hours and hours every day. If you took me and I played music for 10,000 hours, I still wouldn't be a Beatle.
Right.
But I have friends who could hear a song twice and play it on the piano. I had to have music in front of me in order to play. So I don't have that innate ability. I did have an innate ability for mathematics. Mm-hmm. And I think it was inherited. My grandfather went to the 3rd grade in Sweden, and he could do algebra problems in his head.
Right.
Couldn't tell you how he got the answer, but he got the right answer.
Yeah.
So there's that ability. Now, maybe if I had spent 10,000 hours doing mathematics, I might have been a math genius. I didn't. So I think, it's a combination.
Yeah, I've been thinking, and I keep thinking about this. Once on the airplane, I met a woman who had one time been the world champion in motocross bicycle racing, which is, it's motocross. It's not motorcycles, it's bicycles, and they go, rugged terrain, and they do everything, and they do tricks and everything. And she had stepped back to have 2 children, and she was coming back. And it was so interesting sitting next to her, because the minute she sat down next to me, I could feel that she was different. And there was an energy coming from her that was different. And I think it was that focused physical energy that she had to have in order to reach the level that she had, that she was at the peak of her career, and she had been, and now she was heading back for the second peak. And it was so interesting sitting next to her, because it was this intangible difference that an athlete of that caliber has. You know, and again, we could all do motocrossing, or we could all run every single day for 10 miles, but we would never finish first, second, or third at the Boston Marathon. Or at least I know I wouldn't. Not saying anything about anybody else. So, you know, I think there are people who are very talented and very good at what they do, but is that what genius really is? What is it that we expect genius to be? Is it that extra spark?
I'm wondering about, I think, kind of coming out of what you just said, Pam, and also the question that Marianne asked about who decides. I haven't totally thought this through because it's just coming to me, but I feel like the people who we call a genius, oh my gosh, that guy is such a genius at that, whatever it is, are the people that we feel we couldn't do it.
Right.
Like, how do you play that piano so well? How can you make that drawing that I can't even imagine in my mind? And so I wonder if part of the equation is an ability and or the 10,000 hours at something that other people, that we who make that kind of put that label on don't relate to. I think, I'm not a genius, but when I think about things that I do well, okay, so knitting. I don't know if there's such a thing as a knitting genius, but I know how to knit. And there are people who say, oh, I could never do that. I don't know how you do that. Wow, that's so beautiful. And I think, that's no big deal. I just knitted it, I learned how to do it and I did it. The truth is probably somewhere in between. I probably don't value it enough. Other people who don't do it might think that it's a lot cooler than it really is. So I wonder what part that plays in the labeling of it and the deciding of it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of it goes back to what Pam was saying about that. It's thinking outside the box, to be able to take something and, musically, if, you could be a tremendous performer, but not be able to take it to another level.
Right.
And, or artistically, you could be a terrific drawer, but can you do something that is going to grab some other people? Is it going to change how they view? Is it going to make a difference in how art is viewed? Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I think you're getting there. I was trying to think. I think we could all agree that Picasso is a genius, an artistic genius. And why is he an artistic genius? He had the techniques, he had the skills, he had the training. But what did he do? He took so much stuff from around the world, so many ideas from around the world, and he combined them into something completely different. So that if you look at his Cubist series or any of the Demoiselles, you see, you can see the African masks, you can see the angularity of certain other things that's all brought together into a completely new statement. And I think that's what genius is taking those things that we all see, but we don't make that connection.
Yeah, and connection was a word I was just thinking about too. It's being able to see disparate things and to somehow make a connection that nobody else, well, maybe somebody else has made it, but you're able to make it and to make other kinds of of bringing things together that are different, and out of that comes something new, some new insight, you know, that others wouldn't necessarily make. But it still goes back to, you know, how much of it is nurture too, because I'm thinking about Mozart, of course, brilliant and all of that. But then, of course, we know how he was raised in a family. His father, you know, they made sure he was trained from the earliest age, you know, a prodigy, and made money from him and all of that. But he also, so in addition to having whatever that something was that you know, he didn't fail technically. I mean, he was brilliant there, but he had that nurturing. If he had been in another environment, you know, you wonder, you know, would we have had our Mozart if it hadn't been for his father and his family and all of those kinds of influences. And then, of course, he was able to make connections with the sounds of the universe in a certain sense, and bring them together ultimately in his music, and, you know, in new ways, in different ways. So again, it part of it, you know, nature or nurture, always that, there's always that enigma.
What do you think about the role of obsession?
No,
Ooh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, like when you were talking, Pam, about the motocross person, and you know, and the Picasso, and just like having that level of intensity and focus that a lot of us don't either bother to try out or wouldn't dream of trying out because we want kind of a regular lifestyle or something. I mean, what do you think? Because I guess I tend to associate, you know, and not to say that it's a negative thing. I mean, there must have been a lot of joy for the Beatles in making their music, I suspect. But does it seem a bit obsessive to us?
I think so.
I mean, yeah. I mean, 10,000 hours is a long time.
Hemingway, I mean, he wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote, and to hell with everybody else.
Yeah.
And it's true of, well, Bill Gates. What he did was he with computers. Steve Jobs, I think, was obsessive.
Yeah.
Totally obsessed. Yeah.
You know, and then I think about Simone Biles, the
acrobat, not the
The
acrobat.
gymnast.
yeah,
Gymnast.
you know, and the gymnast, and she's a genius at what she does, but the way she learned how to do it was obsessive practicing, you know, hours and hours and hours every day. Now, I'm assuming she had some innate ability in the beginning, but she couldn't have gotten to where she is if she hadn't spent hours every day obsessively working on it. And
I think that's a great example, because I actually just read, there's a big interview with her that I just read this week. And, you know, I mean, she does, in order to, when you are a gymnast like that, you spend 35 hours a week as a little kid training, you know, which is a lot more than other athletes, you know, who are heading for the Olympics. But all the other kids that, you know, on the team also are spending that time. And Simone Biles is the one who is so far ahead of everybody. So, it, you know, there's got to be a combination of, and in the case of an athlete, it's also sort of the genetics of your body. You know, she's got the right size, her center of gravity is what it needs to be able to get way up in the air. And she's got, you know, sort of the sensory ability that I'm sure is both innate and honed by training and practice and attention to know where her body is in space and all that kind of stuff. So I think that's a great example of, you know, she needs both. She has to have that innate ability, but she also has to have the millions of hours. It's probably a lot more than 10,000.
Well, that's an interesting, because I was Baryshnikov, Mikhail Baryshnikov, who didn't start dancing until he was 15 or 16, who never took a formal dance class before that. So you wonder, number one, what was he like as a child? Could we, looking back, see that there was a dancer in him? And what drew him to try out dancing, to apply for dancing at the age of 15? Because that's a very late start for a ballet dancer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And certainly
So you've been weeded out by then.
exactly.
You know, I guess another
You're washed up.
another enigma might be, you know, the person who does all of these things, who has all that we've said, and yet the result is of, you know, one genius whose name I do not recall, but who collected every train ticket and streetcar ticket in Boston, and I forget what he did, but he was so obsessed, and he was from a family which his father, his parents taught at MIT. He had all that background. He had focus. You know, but that's how he used his genius, or maybe you'll just call it autism, which is another thing if you're just talking about, you know, focus and obsession sometimes on certain things where somebody achieves something that is beyond what anybody could do. I think, you know, somebody who collects X, Y, or Z and has the most brilliant collection of, I knew somebody who had the most brilliant collection of antique irons, you know, irons, for example. So, you know, what distinguishes the genius, what we would call genius, from that, where, you know, we start
It's obsession.
We start to make judgments on what it is the output is, so to speak, in a way.
Right.
Anyway,
Right. So that's a good question, because so if you have an obsession, for instance, collecting irons, and you have this brilliant, in-depth, well-researched collection of irons that you have obsessed about and focused on, is that genius? Or would it be more genius of taking those irons and seeing them as something else?
Well, this particular person had sort of a mini museum in his home. He did that. So in that sense, in a small way, shared it. But anyway, but it's.
Yeah, I mean,
well,
even making a
the
collection of
outcome,
irons is a connection that I wouldn't have known.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I was thinking about is art collectors who put together collections that are absolute gems. And I think we tend to think that they might be a genius at looking at art and putting collections together that showcase a certain aspect of art or certain area. We might call that genius, but would we say, oh, well, somebody who could put together a collection of irons wouldn't be a genius? Is it
Yeah, I think
at it differently for different areas.
maybe our expectations for being a genius, I don't know. That's interesting, because yeah, there's no reason. What is the difference between a collection of fine art and a collection of fine irons? And why is a collection of fine art also often made into a museum where people can come in and see it, and a collection of fine iron, a fine collection of irons, could be made into a museum, but not a whole lot of people are going to come to see that?
How about, is it the audience then? Does the audience decide who the genius is?
Well, then that leads you then to, you know, the old, if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it. In other words, if Picasso were in the forest and painting and doing whatever he was doing, and nobody knew about it, I guess Picasso we shouldn't take as an example. I guess I could go back to my
Gauguin.
Gauguin, that's right. Yeah, because he left his family. You're right.
But if nobody knew or appreciated, I mean, there are probably geniuses of all sorts around the world who are doing something, but nobody knows it, or, you know, there isn't an audience, there isn't something from society or culture to reflect, oh, genius. So is that a necessary component, I guess I'm saying, is the, you know, an audience, an appreciator, that there's someone in the forest who hears the sound? Anyway, just pose that.
I think that's a good question, because when you look
Very
at
good question.
Gauguin, he didn't sell anything during his lifetime except to his brother, bought them so that he could stay alive.
Yeah, Van Gogh.
Say now we consider him a genius. Or would other people think he was a?
So that's actually a very good question. I was thinking there was a book, and there was actually a small movie, something about the boy who harnessed the wind, and it's a true story it's like Malawi or someplace like that, some really very poor African country, where this kid was growing up, and his family could no longer afford to send him to school, so he had to stop going to school, but he had a relationship with his teacher, and he could get into the library, and he would take these books that the US had sent, you know, just old books. And he found some old engineering book, and he read it, and he figured out how to build a windmill to harness the wind to create some water for irrigation because this is subsistence farming. And of course they had no money, so he had to go to the dump, and he had to get pieces of bicycles, and he had to get pieces of this. And he made this windmill, and it not only produced water, but he made a second one and produced electricity. And somebody happened to run across him and wrote his story. And then he had a TED talk, and then they made a short movie out of it. But would he have still been, and I think we could call him a genius in that he took the little bits that he had, and he put it all together and made something that to us is not remarkable, but was truly remarkable. If nobody had seen this and nobody had published this, would he still be a genius?
Yes.
Well, yeah. He would be to his town for sure, right? I mean,
yeah, I would think so.
But he would still intrinsically be a genius.
Right. Yeah.
Because, I mean, to do that, I mean, that took a lot to pull all that together.
That's connecting the lines and seeing the dots that nobody else sees. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it is also probably 10,000 hours. And also, you know, when you were talking about that, it made me think of the aphorism about necessity is the mother of invention. And I wonder, you know, that urgent, dire need combined with the time that he had because he couldn't go to school, combined with whatever intrinsic spark of that being able to see those connections comes together. And that's, you know, if we're asking whether it's a weed or whether it takes, you know, a certain habitat, I think that maybe that's the habitat.
Okay, so there's the weed that is in the habitat. Because, yeah, I mean, this is a subsistence farming community. So for how many thousands and thousands of years have they lived exactly the same way? They've, you know, hauled the water. They've tried to keep their crops alive. They've been too far removed for any sort of modern electricity or many modern things. And yet he could read a book and he could figure out how to do it, how to translate that into something for his community.
It sounds as though he might have even had to teach himself to read, at least to be able to read an engineering text.
I think so, yeah. I think he could read. He just he had to figure out how to do engineering, but so he must have had to figure out how to do math, to figure out the math for the engineering, and then be able to connect the lines and the dots and say, okay, I'm seeing this and I can do this here using these things, and giving it a try.
And he had the curiosity and desire. How many thousands of people there never even thought about, how can I do this?
Right. Yeah. How can I make my life easier? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So one of my favorite geniuses is Leonardo.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I think about his great curiosity. I'm glad you brought up curiosity, Colleen, because in addition to Pam's connecting the dots, I think that that motivation is curiosity. And I was really fortunate to see his Leonardo da Vinci sketchbooks at the Met years and years ago. And I think that's where I really caught his genius, because he was making the connection between studying nature around him and drawing these little spiral kind of shapes in his notebook, because he was looking at currents, because he was very curious about how water moved. And then the clever curators put the books on that topic. The pages were separated, unfortunately, because different people own them, like
Bill Gates.
Bill Gates owns a lot of the pages, but so they kind of made the suggestion that he was actually transferring the spiral shape into a woman's hair. So then his drawing process. So I just love that part. And I like what you said, Pam, about the connections, because I think that's a really important piece of it. That it's not just, I'm obsessed with metal that's shaped into irons, but then what? Like maybe, like I don't know that person that you're talking about, Jerry. So I'm not downplaying it. I'm just saying, I don't understand. Like, what would you do then with the irons? But I just love that. I love seeing process. I'm fascinated with people's sketchbooks. And so Leonardo was just such a window to his genius, I thought. And here's somebody that didn't always finish projects either. so I think a lot of his genius, right. So I think a lot of his genius is capital C, curiosity.
So, you know, another person like that is Ben Franklin. If you think about, because I don't think he was particularly well educated. I think wasn't he just a printmaker? He was a printer.
Yeah.
Yeah, with, you know, minimal education, and he was a printer, but he had sketchbooks a lot like that. So he had a scientific curiosity. So he would, you know, take the temperature of the water when he was on the boats so he could figure out the currents. And I mean, obviously he connected the dots so he could figure out electricity, or at least prove that what electricity was, along with, I guess, being a pretty good dancer
And a romance.
and a ladies' man. But
yeah. I think so this is a good segue to Walter Isaacson, you know, who of course who is a chronicler of geniuses, you might say, because he wrote the Franklin, and of course one on Einstein, and the one that perhaps I assume we've all read, which is on Leonardo. And here's one that I just read, and I wasn't familiar with this one. Is it backwards?
Innovators.
Oh. It's backward. Anyway, this is the
I know
Innovators.
it's right on for us.
Pardon?
I see it. It's reading forward.
Is it really? That's interesting.
Yeah.
Because for me, it's backwards. But at any rate, it's and he also wrote the one on Steve Jobs, of course. And he must be a genius himself because of all that he's done, Isaacson. And I mean, he's been head of the Aspen Institute and of Time Magazine and all that. I don't know how he does it all. But at any rate, this is called The Innovators, How a Group of Hackers, Geniuses, and Geeks Created the Digital Revolution. And he has a lot of insights on genius in here. And one of the things he talks about as he kind of chronicles, you know, in time order, sequentially, the development and the different characters who were involved at different points along the way. And so he gets into the whole issue of the individual genius who's working off by himself or herself versus the genius who's in among others and, you know, bouncing ideas around and all of that. So he does a lot with that. And of course comes down for the latter, that is, you know, being where there are many others who of different backgrounds and so on who can bounce off ideas and so on as you go along. The other thing that he is a big issue for him is those who have the connection between science and art. And I found that wonderful to read about some of these, what do I want to call them? I want to say characters, but who were brilliant in both the arts and the sciences, or, you know, who were superb musicians. We hear that often with certain scientists and so on who are also excellent musicians. Anyway, I recommend it. It took me a while to get into because it's a little heavier on the math. It'll be good for Colleen. In the beginning, he was going a little deeper on the math, and I really wanted to go. But anyway, it's another Isaacson. And if you've read any of his works, you know that he knows what he's talking about and does an excellent job. Anyway.
Well, I think a good connection or a good of a genius, a stroke of genius. I don't know if they're really geniuses, but the two young men who started Google, Sergey Brin and Larry Page. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I know Sergey Brin. I'm good friends with the family, and I've watched him grow up. And wow. His younger brother is my son's best friend.
Whoa!
But the fact that those two young men in graduate school in Stanford could take a look at the mathematics needed to do a search engine, because before that there was Yahoo, there was, I forget, there were a couple of other search engines, which were very random. I mean, if you went online and tried to search something, you got random responses. And these two, Sergey and Larry, took a look at what was needed in the mathematics to pull it all together. And they realized that this is what was needed was some sort of organization. And I don't know if you can call them geniuses, but they're certainly a stroke of genius there, that they figured it out. And it became a very elegant solution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Isaacson would say they were. And he does, you know, obviously they're among the ones who are chronicled here. And one of the other things is that Stanford is so important, that whole area with all of, you know, all that bubbling and so on, which attracted people in who were of, you know, superior curiosity and all that. And you think about Florence during, you know, back during the Renaissance and so on, where there's a confluence of people and ideas and all of that bouncing around, and that, you know, out of that soil, which is, you don't get a weed so much because you get very rich soil. But anyway, sometimes the place and the time are really, really critical as well.
I think something that's, when in talking about Florence and also in Venice, where you had the workshops, and people, you know, they start out young in the workshops, and they keep learning and they keep learning, and they're the Leonardos and the Michelangelos and the so many who came out. But there were also dozens, if not hundreds, of others who were in those same workshops who didn't achieve the level that Leonardo did, or that Michelangelo or any of the other major artists that we remember. or, you know, that we think of. So there had to have been both that innate ability that was nurtured, and that they could do something with it that other people couldn't. They could see things that other people couldn't see.
I think that that's what genius is being able to see something that other people can't see, being able to pull things together. I don't know.
And to make it into something, to put it out there beyond just having it in your head. I can see all these connections and so on, but there's
Do something with it.
And
an
action, a product, something that, because I guess you could just be, and probably there have been many geniuses in their heads, you know, by other criteria would be, but nothing came out. There's nothing. I guess again, it's the forest, the tree in the forest, maybe, I don't know, but anyway.
So that gets back to the question is, does it have to be nurtured, or is it just an innate weed? You know, if it's all in your mind, are you still a genius? Or do you have to put it out for the world to see?
I think we probably all know people who are geniuses in their own minds.
Yes. I think we've all had that unfortunate experience.
Well, we have a very stable one in Washington, D.C. right now.
That's true. Yes.
By all of his definitions, he is a genius.
He's stable too. Yes.
Anyway, I wanted to thank you for recommending the violin, the genius of the violin. That was wonderful. I'm so glad I watched it. But what I loved in that, among many things, was the idea that, you know, in playing this instrument, you were playing a genius made this instrument, you know, the very fine violins, and you are playing the music of a genius, maybe not Mendelssohn, but, you know, in other words, you're channeling the genius of the creator of the instrument, the creator of the music, and you putting it together. And in the case of those, they were putting things together in new ways, the four musicians there, and, you know, putting it out there too. So I love that idea that they were, you know, in a way, what do you want to say, transits for genius? They weren't claiming that they themselves were, but that they were enabling something.
It's almost like a collaboration over time, or, you know, instead of a simultaneous collaboration.
No. Anyway, that was worthy. I was
good.
How they interpreted it could have been genius.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Billie Holiday, right?
Yeah.
A lot of people could sing the same songs that Billie Holiday sang and not be called a genius.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah.
Well, believe it or not, it's already 5:45.
This went fast.
So
yeah,
I know. Time flies when you're having fun, right? So we will wrap it up. Does anybody have any final thoughts that are burning before we finish up?
No, but I had one question I'm going to leave everybody with. So I think it was Colleen, but there were a couple of mentions of obsession. And I started thinking about who has the ability to obsess over something. And you always think of the men obsessing over something. Do women get to obsess on a genius level?
Oh, yeah.
Women have to do dishes and laundry.
Yeah.
And I can't think of her last name. Rosalind. She's the one who actually came up with
the DNA.
DNA.
Yeah.
And I can't think of her last name.
That's right.
But I've read her.
She was obsessed.
Biography. She was obsessed.
She was. Yeah.
And her.
She was brilliant. Yeah.
her thunder was stolen by Watson and Crick, but
Right, yeah, yeah.
but definitely Marie Curie.
Marie Curie, yes. But she had a very supportive husband. And I keep thinking about, particularly over the centuries, how women have not really had an opportunity to do that because they're doing something. And I still remember probably back in the 80s or 90s, there was a chemist at Hopkins, woman chemist, I don't remember her name, but she won the Nobel Prize for chemistry. And they called her from Sweden, and they call her at noon from Sweden, and it's 5 a.m. in Baltimore. And when they interviewed her, when she was interviewed later on, she said she was up at 5 o'clock and she was doing the laundry and getting the kids' school lunches ready when the call came in. Mm-hmm. And so she at first thought it was a joke, because here she was doing all the housewifely things before she went off to work. And oh, by the way, in the middle of this, you won the Nobel Prize for chemistry.
That's great.
I think that's a really good point.
Yeah. I mean, do women actually have the same opportunity to obsess as men?
No.
No way.
That's the next topic. That's the next topic.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Okay.
Another rhetorical question is.
Everybody bring one.
Anyway, one other rhetorical question is, we only looked at positive results of genius because we haven't really, the whole thing of an evil genius. So, but enough of that.
Yeah.
We didn't have a chance to even.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. Or the other one, there's a documentary on PBS called The Man Who Fed the World. And it's about the guy who developed the Green Revolution in the 40s.
Yeah.
So it's basically modern farming, which is highly dependent on fertilizers and stripping the soil and, mass production. I think in many ways what he did was genius, but there were unintended consequences.
Mm-hmm. That's another thing too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you should watch it. It's a very good documentary. I think it's called The Man Who Fed the World. Anyway.
All right.
Thank you, Pam.
Thank you for participating.
Thank you. Yeah, let's have our toast. Let's toast to having the opportunity to obsess over something.
Yes.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
See you all. Everybody stay cool.
You too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.